Imagine turning on your TV and seeing nothing but a blank screen. For millions of South Africans, this could soon become a reality due to the analog switch off. If you rely on old antennas and don't have a decoder or satellite dish, free TV will disappear from your screen. This transition to digital broadcasting is part of a global UN-backed initiative to free up spectrum for technologies like 5G.
We'll thereafter progressively switch off all remaining sites.
But South Africa's 20-year journey has been plagued by delays, shifting policies, and poor leadership. With 12 ministers overseeing the process and no clear direction, 4.5 million households are now at risk of losing access to free television.
You can grab somebody on the road right now and ask him about this subject. They don't have a clue. We're counting days now. I mean, 31st of March. So trust me, once they switch off, a lot of people would be confused.
We undertook as a country to switch to digital in about 2007, 2006. We changed the license of ETV in 2007, 2008. We got digital broadcasting in the form of DTT up and going, I think, in 2008. And the idea was that over time, we would switch off the analog and everybody would be on DTT. From there, unfortunately, it would take 12 ministers. Absolutely nothing happened for a decade.
The whole analog switch-off thing is symptomatic of policy uncertainty that's been going on in South Africa. You know, we've had no less than 3 policy review processes since 2011, I think it is, that have all been kind of aborted. And so, you know, at the moment, the broadcasting policy is completely out of date with the changes that are taking place in the technological environment.
The DTT technology has reached end of life. I think globally it's no longer a standard that is being used. And I think South Africa itself has admitted that the fact that Sentech is now bringing in DTH boxes is a sign that there's been an understanding that that technology is a sunset technology.
You had people that had registered, yet, when they now needed to install set-top boxes, the people that had registered were not able to get those set-top boxes. In fact, they were piling up at, the post offices.
Digital terrestrial television, DTT, is really a broadcast distribution technology. In other words, it's a way of disseminating or distributing broadcast signals more efficiently than what people call analog. You know, the bunny ears, where millions of people are still on analog, but that was a very inefficient, it took up a lot of space in the frequency system.
At the heart of South Africa's broadcasting crisis lies a technological dilemma: digital terrestrial television or satellite. DTT was once seen as the future, but as delays mounted, the technology fell behind. Satellite broadcasting, on the other hand, is already adopted by over 12 million South African households and eliminates the need for costly infrastructure like transmitters and towers. So why is South Africa still clinging to DTT?
Government chose to do it on a terrestrial system. The justification was that we don't control the satellites and the satellite owner could switch us off. And if all our communications as a country are going via a satellite, we've lost autonomy. But the truth of the matter is the terrestrial system is too expensive, it's too patchy, it doesn't reach enough people, and it's a failure as a system on its own. You have to do it in conjunction with satellite. And given all the dithering that there's been, you've got so few people on the terrestrial system that the satellite becomes the main and only way of distributing signal.
At the time, it was a cutting-edge technology for distributing television signals. It was introduced in Europe and was used by many British broadcasters. Now, many, many years later, over 16 years later, since regulations were first passed in South Africa, it is no longer that cutting-edge technology and has really been bypassed by 2 platforms. One is satellite and the second is the internet.
If you look at a terrestrial system, You've got to have a mast, you've got to have a transmitter, it's out in the rain, it rusts, you've got to have people to maintain it. The costs of maintaining a physical infrastructure like that. They set up DTT transmitters in 2006. They're almost 20 years old. They last 20 to 30 years.
4.5 million households in South Africa are still watching analog TV. Until such time as, say, 90% of those households have migrated to digital, then we can stop broadcasting on analog, but not before then. We do not understand what is the rush.
Would you be in a sustainable business if it took you 15 years on a technology rollout and your platform was still the smallest in the country? Because if you look at the platform, satellite, if you take MultiChoice and OpenView together, that's over 10 million households out of 16 million television households that are on satellite. Then you get the 6 million, 5 to 6 million that are still on analog, and then you get the 1 million that are on DTT. That in anyone's book is a failed technology rollout, and it is, I believe, the biggest failed technology rollout in post-apartheid South Africa. And I think now's the time to say, how do we accept that and put our energies into a different platform, and I'd say 2 different platforms, satellite and streaming. Because basically those are the 2, let's call them TV and audio-visual platforms that are the biggest and are the most future-proof at the moment. Satellite reaches everywhere in the country, whereas DTT still had these pockets where you couldn't reach all communities. So I think there needs to be an acceptance, but it's a very difficult acceptance because of the money that has been sunk. And also there's pressure. As you may know, there's pressure from the mobile operators who've been promised that spectrum. And they can only get all that spectrum after the broadcasters have been moved off. So we're in a bit of a catch-22 situation.
For broadcasters, the delays and mismanagement of the analog switch-off have been devastating. Advertising revenue, a key source of income, depends on audience size. But with fragmented platforms and shrinking reach, broadcasters are struggling to stay afloat.
When you do that for a decade and more, you will never get a vast number of people changing to DTT because they're all on satellite. Today, we've got 16 million television households. We've got probably 1 million that are on DTT. So in order to broadcast on that platform, you're only reaching a 16th of the audience. So when you say a 16th of the audience would generate a 16th of the advertising revenue, that's not true, because people who can't afford to buy things are not useful to advertisers. They're interested in richer audiences.
From our perspective, this represents a huge existential threat to Cape Town TV, which is a non-profit community broadcaster with a very strong public service mandate. We can't afford to lose 40% of our audience because that's going to hit our advertising. We are 60% dependent on advertising as a source of revenue. So that's obviously the huge number one consideration for us. But I think a much bigger, issue is the poorest of the poor, the working class communities, the most vulnerable citizens of South Africa who are still watching television on old school analog TV sets are going to wake up on April Fool's Day and they're going to turn their TV sets on and they're not going to access television. To threaten the existence of public interest free-to-air television in this context, I think is very, very dangerous for our democracy.
Since 2008, SABC used to have 66% of market share for TV, and at the moment we sit at 22%. In that 60% plus market share, the loss, which is about 40% of that loss, actually was due to analog switch off in the different provinces. As you know, it's now only 4 provinces that are left because about 82% of the analog switch off has been executed. So from an SABC perspective, this is quite a risk for our operations because, as you know, SABC is the most commercial public broadcaster in the world. 83% of our revenue comes from advertising, 13% from TV licenses, or only 4% come from government in the form of a grant. So you can imagine if this switch off goes ahead, it means that the SABC stands on the cusp, on the precipice of quite a massive disruption.
It's going to die. Let me tell you, the DTT technology, it's way too expensive for any community channel to maintain. Roughly, on a monthly basis, just for transmission, we're expected to pay almost 2 million. Almost 2 million, somewhere there. Which community broadcaster will afford that?
The problem with all these things is that there are state institutions, in this case Centec, that depends entirely on the SABC and ETV for its revenue. As soon as you switch off the analog and that revenue stops, they absolutely need for those broadcasters to pay the same revenue to them on DTT as they would charge. But since they don't reach a tenth of the people, you're paying 10 times as much per person. So it isn't practical.
There needs to be, conversations that are held with the broadcasters, with organizations like ourselves, because if you look at DTT, it's ridiculous how much now broadcasters will have to pay for the, Centec tariffs. So, there's also that to say, is it really sustainable for broadcasters?
For millions of South Africans, free-to-air television isn't just about entertainment, it's a lifeline. It's where they get their news, they learn about their rights, and stay informed during elections. But with the analog switch-off looming, these households face being left in the dark. Many of the affected households live in rural and township communities where free-to-air TV is often the only accessible source of information. Despite this, public awareness campaigns have been minimal, and the government's rollout of digital set-top boxes has been plagued by delays and mismanagement.
The costs for ETV to be on that platform are greater than the entire revenue that would be generated by the audience. It can never survive. It will close down sooner than later. And the question is, what's supposed to happen to people who can't afford pay television? They won't get free TV anymore because analog will be switched off and DTT will be unaffordable to the broadcaster.
It's quite worrisome because people are going to wake up to blank television screens. They're not going to have information. They're not going to be able to access entertainment. If you look at the role that the public broadcaster plays around informing the public, it is literally, the biggest, source of information for the majority of poor people because it is also freely accessible. So now you've got people that will not be informed. They will not be able to make informed decisions because they don't know what's happening, in the world around them.
The government is obliged through the DT regulation to roll out set-top boxes to so-called indigent households. So strictly speaking, according to the law, before they switch off analog TV, they have to roll out set-top boxes to indigent households. Now, in 2004, 6 or whatever it was, an indigent household may have been defined as a household earning 3,500 Rand per month. It's certainly not the definition today. The Stats SA definition of an indigent household is 6,500 a month. Right there, you have a hopelessly flawed rollout plan.
You've got the missing middle, which means somebody that gets 3,600, that person needs to fend for themselves. They need to be able to self-migrate. They don't know where to get these set-top boxes, because there's also lack of information around that. But also you don't have these set-top boxes in retail stores. So where exactly are people going to get these set-top boxes?
That promise was watered down from 5 million set-top boxes to be distributed for free to only indigent households that had registered for the boxes. I think about 1.5 million people registered, and therefore governments revised its promise to say, well, we're not going to distribute it to everyone who needs it. We only going to distribute it to the people who say they need it.
I haven't come across a house that has got a subsidized set-top box so far. I'm not saying they are not there in Soweto. I'm saying I haven't come across any household that has got that. But I believe that maybe they are there.
Let's get more details now and also get reaction to this development and the story that has been over a decade in the making.
South Africa's digital migration has been marked by missed opportunities and policy failures. Corruption, inefficiency, and a lack of consultation have derailed what should have been a straightforward process.
If you look at DTT, it was a technology project which I think government spent billions on, and it was meant to really improve television distribution in South Africa. But instead of having a few people lead it over all these decades, we had so many ministers, so therefore you had different leadership. And so on the one hand, I would say it was a failure of leadership continuity. Because of the time that it took, policy needed to be amended over the years. So what happened is a policy that was designed in 2008 and then 2012 gradually over the years became less and less fit for purpose. And because of the lack of consistency in political leadership at the ministerial level, at the Director General level, it just started really failing to be something that people wanted to do, to the extent that a lot of suppliers were stopped even carrying the boxes in their shops.
Government has to address itself to its own failures. Its own failures are dithered for a decade and a half, and life moved on and left them behind. You can't pursue a policy that just simply has no prospect of getting most people onto that platform.
Unfortunately, the desire to somehow turn DTT into a kind of industrial development policy which would promote black manufacturers, while it was laudable, it actually became part of the problem because there was a lot of corruption in the procurement processes. That was a very important fork in the road. You don't have broadcasters around the world, whether they're public broadcasters or commercial broadcasters, that are completely not involved in the distribution of such a vital consumer electronic piece that is going to go into people's homes and is going to receive your content. That was really a big mistake, and I don't think we've ever recovered from that.
That's why we have been saying that consultations are important, and that's something that's also been missing from how government has undertaken this process. For instance, ourselves as SOS and Media Monitoring Africa, we haven't been consulted. Yes, the broadcasters have been consulted, but we represent the public interest.
There's no clear way forward, but solutions have been proposed. A nationwide shift to satellite broadcasting with subsidies for digital set-top boxes seems the most practical. Modern streaming platforms offer potential, though high data costs remain a major barrier.
At some stage, somebody has got to wake up and say, look, we messed this thing up. It's too late. We can't fix DTT. We have to close it. We are going to have to move people a second time. We encourage them to move to DTT. We put them on a platform that's not viable, and we've got to get them off it. Where they're going to go, they have to go onto satellite. That's the only other platform that's available. I think that is shameful, to be honest, is that a government that's supposedly alive to the needs and wishes of the poorer sections of our population should be completely indifferent and should say, well, you got to pay. If you can't pay R1,000 a month, you can't have the channels. That's how it is.
From an SABC perspective, we've made it very clear that based on the delays we've experienced with the BDM program, which is the Broadcast Digital Migration Program, the SABC is not prepared for this. Not just the SABC, the country is not prepared for this. And therefore, to that effect, we have requested the postponement of the analog switch off.
The SABC is a public media service. In other words, it should be freely accessible to all South Africans on all the platforms. And I've mentioned that data should be subsidized. But yes, I think SABC television is part of the package. I don't think, we're in 2025. To say that certain South Africans should be relegated to radio or audio only, I think is wrong. I think they need to not be left behind and see this digital divide broadened in an era where everyone is trying to narrow that divide.
At the moment, you've got, let's say, 1 million people, 1 million homes on DTT. it's not all of those homes that the state is responsible for, but say it is 300,000 times 1,000 per person would be 300 million rand to shift everybody that the state is responsible for onto a satellite system. And at least they would be able to hold their head up high and say, we messed it up, but we fixed it.
A quid pro quo could be that in the money that the mobile operators give government for the spectrum, government could either directly help subsidize data, or the mobile operators should be, as a condition of their licenses, be reducing the cost of the data. Then you could have a situation where more people could get access to streaming. And there's an argument that SABC News should be zero rated. What does that zero rated mean? It means certain public services should not attract any data costs.
Up to now, we've not heard one person from government address themselves to this problem. All they want to talk about is what day are we switching off analog. Until somebody can, answer the question of what's going to happen to DTT when you switch off analog, I would say you don't have the beginning of an understanding of the problem, and you certainly will never solve access of homes to free television until you actually start to sort of grapple with the problem.
The analog switch-off represents both a challenge and an opportunity. Managed poorly, it could leave millions without access to television, deepen the digital divide, and threaten the future of free-to-air broadcasting. As the clock ticks towards the next deadline, the question remains, can the country build a broadcasting future that serves all South Africans and leaves no one behind?
The government hasn't created the space for us as broadcasters to come together with the people who run this country to say, how can we find a solution to this? In fact, under the previous minister, I must say Solly Malatsi, to his credit, has been much more open to engaging with us, although he's only been in the very hot seat for a very short period of time. But prior to that, we've felt bullied. We've felt unheard. We felt that, that like people don't really care about what's going on here. So yeah, we're feeling a bit jaded about it all, to be quite honest.
You cannot forge ahead with the analog switch off when the groundwork has not been done. We are here talking about millions of people that are going to be without, television information. Government needs to just postpone the analog switch off.
In the last few years, we've seen 5 of the smaller provinces switched off. That immediately caused massive audience losses for the SABC. We've held back as a country on switching off the 4 biggest provinces, KZN, Eastern Cape, Western Cape, and Gauteng. That's where 67% of the television audience is. Now, if we saw massive audience losses in the smaller provinces, one can only imagine that SABC will hemorrhage audiences if we switch off those 4 provinces, and hence the real move by civil society, by the broadcasters, etc., that they say, no, not so fast. You haven't fulfilled your promise to make sure that everyone who needed it would not be left behind. And I think it's quite clear, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's saying this, that millions of households will be left behind, and we haven't heard yet how those households should be catered for. What happens to them when their screens either go dark or just show snowy pictures on the day of the switch off? How are we going to cater for them?